So thanks everyone for joining us today this morning or evening or afternoon for webinar on how to operationalize data mapping for engineering. We are going to get into the weeds of data mapping and discuss all our learnings, and I'm going to rope in learnings from my dear friend Steve as well on his own experiences, both from privacy and security. Having said that, let's kickstart the webinar. So before we start, a quick introduction. I am Vaibhav. I'm the founder and CEO at Privado. Privado is a code scanning tool purpose-built for privacy, and we enable fast-moving technology companies to continue to innovate, ship products fast without breaking any privacy law or leaking customer data. With me is Steve on the call, Stephen Davis. I know him since now it seems ages. I met him while we were doing our research about Privado, and then has been super helpful in both being a customer but also helping us shape up the product. So, Steve, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Certainly. Hi, Steve Davis. Excuse me, a little frog in my throat. I've been working in the security and privacy space for 20, 25 plus years at this point in time, and learned about Privado by happenstance and connected with me, and really found this to be solving a very unique and specific problem that I had been trying to solve for some time. And so super excited to be able to connect with you all to talk a little bit about it.
Awesome, perfect. So let's get started. Yeah, Steve, so I think this topic itself is super dear to my heart. In fact, like my entire introduction to privacy or GDPR compliance started when I was a product manager, and I got my first assessments for this data mapping project back in 2018. And which sort of brings me to the question, it's 2022 now. Why are we still talking about data mapping? Wasn't it the topic of 2016 to 18 when GDPR or CCPA came?
It was indeed, and ironically, we are still solving it the same way we did back then. You'd think that the billions of dollars and time, energy, and effort from companies large, medium, and small, took at those early days of GDPR to really assess their ecosystems, their technology and business ecosystems, to really perform these highly detailed and meaningful data mapping exercises would have lent the larger technology ecosystem to have identified this as a very real area and a very real area and problem area rather that needs to be solved. And we would have seen sort of this flood of tools surface to help us solve these problems. And the irony is, we're still doing a lot of the same work we did, back then the same way now, sending out, creating surveys, sending out surveys, asking folks to validate this information, that information, to check these boxes around what data elements they have, has it changed? And so by the time, the privacy and or security team, or at least the team that, has the responsibility to sort of oversee this, gets the inputs back from all the different stakeholders, domestically and or globally, if that's the type of organization you're in, you're already dealing with old data. And so it's very frustrating from a privacy perspective, because you really want to work to try and solve this data mapping challenge, and the tools and tech just haven't been out there to solve it. And it's why when I saw Privado, it really was a very meaningful sort of wow moment for me.
Yeah, and I think it's in the news everywhere. Before the call, also while we were preparing the presentation, I think these specifically both Meta and Twitter came up. So would love your thoughts here as well.
Yeah, I mean, this just goes to show. I mean, this was just a couple weeks ago. It just goes to show how organizations large and small are still working to try and solve this massively, massively difficult challenge, which is what are companies doing with data? And if you think about companies like Meta, that they shared this was shocking. And I'm going to take a moment to read it because I think it is very important. This is them saying, we do not have an adequate level of control and explainability over how our systems use data, and thus we can't confidently make controlled policy changes or external commitments such as we will not use X data for Y purposes. And yet, this is exactly what regulators expect us to do, increase our risk of mistakes and misrepresentation. And the context of this was interesting, but that they said this was just hugely shocking. Oh, sorry, hugely meaningful, not shocking, but hugely meaningful. And then if we look at the Twitter quote, it's sort of equally as interesting. Twitter doesn't understand how much data it collects, why it collects it, and how it's supposed to be used. Like, misery loves company, and so that other companies like Twitter and Facebook are in the same boat. Yay! But that we've been dealing with GDPR for a while at this point in time, and what these quotes sort of remind us is that we're not that much closer to sort of solving that data mapping problem than we were back then. It was problematic and scary. I mean, as security and privacy professionals, we have a responsibility to do everything we can to try and meet the challenge that the regulations put forth. But as consumers, our data's out there too. We want to protect it, and that these platforms acknowledge that they don't have the right tools, tech, and processes in place is very scary.
Yeah, and so it completely makes sense. I mean, if it's companies with huge, I would say, infinite resources, people are not able to solve it. It does seem that data mapping is still talk of the town in 2022, and probably will still remain talk of the town since probably in a couple more years. Hopefully we solve it, but yeah, it's still relevant today. It seems like that. So awesome. So what we'll do next is we'll get into the weeds of data mapping itself. What are we doing today? What are the challenges you face if you follow the traditional approach with your engineering team? How can you improve it? Probably take some information back and start applying in your companies. And then at the end of it, if Privado can help there as well. So again, full disclaimer, we'll try to make sure we give you some information without Privado being there, and that should help you as is. But yeah, towards the end, we'll also give you a quick demo. So with that context, I mean, we know data mapping is a big challenge, but it's also the key ask, right? So if you're building your privacy program, the foundation becomes data mapping itself. And this is not just us talking. This is like from a survey from IAPP and EY, I think 2021, where over 90% of privacy teams responded as data mapping and data inventory as their key priority. And if you look at the figure on the right, it makes sense, right? Because your data mapping is the foundation. If you do it right, you know the 3Ws. You know what data you're processing, why you're processing, and where, which third parties, which databases, which APIs, which services, which teams have access to data, right? So if you have the data mapping and inventory right, you can go ahead and make representations which are correct. Your privacy policies are true. Your app disclosures, like your just-in-time notices or your Apple nutrition label, privacy Play Store data safety report is accurate and up to date. Your ROPA reports, GDPR Article 30 reports, which are your representation to a regulator, is accurate. So if you have your data mapping, the first thing which enables you to do is you make true representation to your end users and the regulators, be it FTC or the regulators in Europe. The second thing this foundation will really help you to do is make your operations simpler. Because at the end of the day, when you get a subject access request or a deletion request, you need to know very quickly which are the third parties, which are the databases, your true inventory, where you either need to go and delete the data from or export the data from. So your privacy operations become simpler if you have a correct data mapping and data inventory. Your consent becomes easier because you know your mobile app and all the SDKs, which is getting access to data where you need a consent before data can flow there. And you can implement your privacy control like data minimization, like purpose limitation, probably anonymization. All of that privacy controls can only be done when you have the visibility with data mapping. So all in all, if you have a good data map, you are in a you have a really solid foundation to a privacy program. And if it is not, if it's shaky, then like the privacy program building can actually fall. So that's probably the closest example I could think of. And then if you look at the current approach, right, and this is probably where even I started my first assessments, where I caught, and even I am start trying to remember the first project I did was for an e-commerce company, wherein what we were trying to do was, let's start with the business process, or what we like to call processing activity. It's also part of the full form of ROPA report, right? Record of processing activities. So you start with your business process and you go from there. And it's an interesting process. It basically actually works, in my opinion, for some departments. Like essentially you go to the business head, try to interview them and try to get a list of business process. Then you send assessments to the people who actually run the process. You get your data understanding of what data you're collecting, where data is going for sharing, storage, which teams have access to the data. You review it, add the privacy controls, get the legal basis in place, and generate your compliance report, your privacy report, and hopefully your process itself is better from an end user's perspective, is not violating any law, and you have made it watertight, right? And if I have to think about it, like certain departments that works really well. For example, let's take HR as an example, right? So you can literally define processes with the business head as recruitment or performance management or appraisal, right? And then even if, let's say, a pool of privacy professionals come together, and if you start to share this knowledge, you can probably reach 80% of it really, really fast. The thing it breaks is when it comes to engineering, and we have like a full section around it. But before I jump there, Steve, would love to hear from you how this process, I mean, you have gone through this process, I'm sure, multiple times. What's been your experience? When does it work? And when it does not work?
So, it's interesting because, this really is, this is a process that works, and the problem is the outcome is getting data that isn't quite as relevant or as close to current state as you like. And the challenge with that is, as part of the interview and assessment process, if you're able to get that, same day in real time, yay. That never happens. You're sending out questionnaires, you then wait a couple weeks, then you send out the reminder, then you wait a couple more weeks. And so it's this, this time suck. And instead of being, instead of focusing on the data elements and how to protect those data elements, as privacy professionals, we become, housekeepers getting, trying to get folks to answer questionnaires. When they finally do, the data, could be weeks, months even old. And so, and then once we get it, we're able, the decoding and development may have even started already, and we have no insight into that. And so you've got, you've got this process whereby you go through the interviews, you go through the questionnaires, you really try and get the data. But then irrespective of how long that whole process takes, you get to the coding, and typically, privacy groups have very little insight into what's actually happening during that coding phase. And so you just sort of hope and pray that, everything that you put into the PIA or all of the data elements that you agree to during the requirements process are being satisfied as part of the development and coding process. And by the time it comes out, you're lucky if you get a couple days with it to review it before it's pushed to production. So this process is a process, certainly, and if you're lucky enough to be able to have stakeholders that work with you real time, great. But it's just not been my experience and the experience that I've connected with hundreds of privacy professionals on. And so it again sort of led me, when I saw Privado, to be like, there's got to be a better way. And so when I saw Privado, I was like, oh wow, this might be it. So that's been my experience. And again, from my working in privacy for 2 decades at this point in time has been the experience of almost everybody I've spoken to.
Thanks for sharing your experience, Steve. There was one question probably related to it, which was, can you give some more examples other than HR where it could work? Yeah, I can, like probably finance, expense management, payroll management could look like a process which is very similar in each company. Like the vendors could change, your SharePoint drives could change. You might not put it in Google Drive, but in SharePoint Drive. But pretty much the starting points are similar in specifically some departments. Uh, where it diverges is probably engineering, which is so unique. Every company builds code and products and applications very, very uniquely. It's also an IP. It's also something everyone guards. So we'll come to that next probably. Awesome. So yeah, in fact, that's my next slide. And just to sort of tie this back, Steve, to your point, in fact, my first project, as I was talking about, was data mapping for an e-commerce company, where pretty much everything was done programmatically via code by their engineering and product managers. I remember I created a huge spreadsheet of over 200, 250 rows, interviewing product managers, engineers. And at the end of the day, when I went back to the privacy team, they asked me, hey, is this accurate? And I was like, if I do the maths right, you have a 4-week sprint cycle, let's say 6. So probably you have at least 4 to 5 sprints live. And I don't know which one of it is accurate and which one of it is not accurate or up to date. And accuracy, even I wasn't sure because I was just collecting everything manually. So yeah, very painful experience of doing that for engineering, both for me and for engineers and product managers. I could empathize as well because I was a product manager before that. So I could see the frustration when we were trying to ask those questions, because sometimes it was an inherited product. They did not know anything about it. They just started the job and they were given these assessments to fill. So they were as confused as we were. But I think one good thing came out of it was we got the idea of Privado. So I would say experience worth living. Uh, and yeah, if we sort of take like a step back and see the process flow we looked at in the last slide, essentially it breaks because engineering does not work as a process. It's essentially, there is no business process in engineering. It's all code. Everything to uh, like basically how you collect data, how you share data, how you store data, how you log data, how your data moves. Everything is written by developers as code, pushed to production to the live environment, and then it starts to do its job, right? Like you have a mobile app in which if the code says that you will collect location data, it will collect location data. It's written in the code, right? So that's the difference in engineering. There is no business process. It's everything is written as code. And that's been the biggest gap I've seen. Essentially, when we try to apply the approach of this business process to engineering, the biggest gap I personally saw, and more people I've been speaking to, is that there is this huge gap in language. So it's like, you lose stuff in translation. Like privacy and security teams are speaking one language, developers and product managers are speaking completely different language. And I'm just going to use a couple of examples for that, right? So for example, let's say in our traditional privacy world, we talk about business process or processing activity. If you look at engineering, they have apps, mobile apps, web apps, services, APIs. Netflix has over 1,000 services, right? So it's famous for that. Data pipelines to move your data from your Snowflake account to Salesforce, Slack. All of this is done programmatically with code. Once it live, millions of users' data can move just by like a piece of code which is sitting right there. So that's like the first disjoint experience. Another example, in a traditional PI, we would ask, hey, which team have access to data? In a classic engineering side, it changes. It could be which APIs have, which bots have access to data. You might have a Slack bot taking the data and putting it in a Slack channel where names, credit card, order history might be just going as Slack messages in error, right? So that's how the difference happens. And the frustration I've seen that is it leads to a lot of lost hours. So the developer's productivity goes down. A lot of cost gets involved, both on privacy security side and also on developer side, because you're not speaking the same language, and there is a lot of time you will lose in this translation. And this becomes important in today's business environment as well, because you want your developers to be free to be able to do releases on time, but at the same time, you can't leave privacy, right? So you need a solution which gives you the speed of development, but gives you privacy as well. The second challenge we've seen, again, this is super unique for engineering, is data processing is super distributed and it changes all the time. What it simply means is if you look at any other department, like I was talking about, it's driven by business heads, right? So let's say if there is HR department, they will buy a HRMS tool, let's say Workday, and that's a decision which was made probably once, and then you will not change it for a couple of years. So your processing will get tied to that vendor and it will pretty much remain the same. Engineering is completely different. Engineering, you have pods, you have decentralized team. Their core goal is to release code faster, to release more features, to get more engagement, to optimize, to have lesser page load times. To do all of that, they have small teams, each making their own decision of what data they're going to collect, where they're going to send it for storage, where it's going to be shared, where it's going to be leaked, which logging system are they going to use, so on and so forth. So here is this big disconnect. You can't have business heads in engineering or engineering heads and get information. You have to talk to each pod if you're doing an assessment. It's impossible to do that. The second biggest problem is the change frequency. Probably in a typical business process, it might change once or twice a year. In engineering, they have releases every 15 days, every month, every 1.5 months. And if you look at in a company across all these teams, probably every day there is some code change which is happening in your company that you don't know about. And what it leads to is, because it's super distributed, you are speaking a different language and it's changing all the time. It leads to the same conversation we were having, Steve, on the meta side that, hey, regulators expect you to make these top-down privacy commitments, but you don't know the reality. So there is this huge gap between the two that leads to non-compliance and fines, right? And that was my next point, right? So essentially, this is the point I was trying to make, that if you have this data map which is inaccurate, you can't make representations which are accurate, which means your privacy policy will be inaccurate, your ROPA reports would be out of date, your operations will be suboptimal because you will say you've deleted data, but then the user's data will be there, they will get an email, they'll file a regulatory complaint, or your privacy controls will fail. So what I really wanted to do today was give some examples which are from real life, and then take them. And again, like this can happen with anyone, because as we discussed, like getting an accurate data map is a big challenge. But these examples are like case studies from where we can learn some of these things and the consequences of having an inaccurate data map. So the first one is Flow App. So essentially, why I chose this was in news recently. After recently FTC had a guidance on protecting sensitive data flows or preventing sensitive data flows to add SDKs, third-party SDKs. And the example there which was given was Flow App. And the scenario was pretty simple. The app had promised in their privacy policy they will never share health data with any third party. But in reality, and this is me talking as a product manager, we have SDKs to collect analytics data to measure the performance of our features, and we send event data there. The problem, and this might be fine if you are a Spotify, right? You are measuring if someone is listening to a podcast or not. But when it comes to Flow app, they were sending events like, hey, have you put in a notification or a reminder for your pregnancy? So the usage data here was literally sort of showing health events. So the usage event data became health data, and that was flowing to these third-party analytics vendor like Facebook, Google, and Flurry, and that was the mismatch. So in your privacy policy, you had no sharing. In reality, in code, there was sharing. So the reason this happened was because this data map which was created did not have this information. You were not able to pull this off from the code. It was inaccurate, a wrong privacy policy, a misrepresentation, and then an FTC investigation. So that's first example. Again, very normal use case of what happened. The only thing is, since you're not able to bridge the gap between what developers are doing and what the risk is, such things can happen. The second example is of Twitter. This was, I think, a huge fine, if I remember correctly. I think $150 million or something, or at least this was part of the problem. The thing was, when Twitter started to collect phone numbers, the reason was, or the purpose was two-factor or multi-factor authentication. But in reality, what was happening was this two phone numbers were flowing to ad SDKs. Now, imagine if you would have this accurate data map where you would see the flow of phone number to a Google Ad SDK, and you would have a policy which was flowing in from the promises you made, you could have put in that privacy control of purpose limitation. The problem is, again, the same, because you don't know what's happening in the code and you still have to make those representation. There is a mismatch, and that leads to investigation, fines, and a lot of bad news. Right? And again, these are just two examples of case studies. Such things will happen, and probably will get more example. Till we are closer to the code, we will find a lot of these mismatches. And as I said, like probably we'll give you a solution which is independent of Privado. I think the right answer to do is align with what developers are doing and probably even what security teams are doing. So the solution is, if you change your approach from a business process to an application, or even take a step ahead and say, I will do the mapping on each code repository. This is where developers are writing the code to make the decision to collect data, share data, store data, log data. If you do the mapping on a repository level, we will be in sync with developers. And I think on security, we do it something like that, Steve, right? Like all the vulnerabilities are open on a repository and are fixed before they go to production. So what's, and you have seen this happening and you've already seen use the product enough. What's been your experience on moving from a process approach to an application approach, Steve?
Well, I've always, offered that, privacy is much of a technology issue as it is a sort of business process issue. And, what I find challenging is a lot of companies really just focus on sort of that business process piece and just either don't think about or neglect that technology piece. And that's why we see sort of the issues that we did, at Twitter and Flow. I mean, it's not, I don't believe that again, sort of going back to one of the earlier slides about the data mapping process, I don't think folks are actively trying to mislead or misinterpret, what data elements are being captured. It's just that they don't know what they don't know. And because developers aren't business folks, and business folks aren't developers, to your earlier point about the translation, a lot gets lost in translation. More so, a lot gets lost to just time. People don't have the bandwidth. Teams don't have the bandwidth to really dive into the code, to really surface the data elements that are being called. And it's so easy for developers to grab different repos to perform, specific functions. And, they may or may not realize that, this repo that they're grabbing, this this code that they're grabbing rather from this repo is now all of a sudden asking for, 3 additional data elements that, were approved. And so, again, I don't think it's anybody trying to be misleading or inaccurate. It's just, there's the complexity of this ecosystem is such that unless you have a tool inside of the code looking at it, you're just never going to be able to surface all the data elements that could be pulled and surfaced, because these products and services are just so complex and complicated at this point in time. And so again, that's why, when I first saw Privado, it was sort of like a wow moment, because it really was that sort of that it was breaking open that black box of development in a way that, I think really at least begins to try and solve that problem. And what was particularly exciting for me was it didn't add additional risk. It didn't take a copy of the code and the data. And so now I'm expanding my risk for my data and giving it to yet another provider to look at and assess. Rather, it just focused on the data elements, and it just surfaced the data elements without ever looking at the data itself. And again, for me, it's a tool that solves a problem with, while at the same time sort of minimizing the risk around the data. So it was a win-win, at least in my opinion. So I'm a firm believer that when it comes to working, to try and solve problems in technology, particularly in products, you got to go to the code. That's where it is. And so again, I think how you all have looked to try and create a dev-friendly approach, and having having sort of a slogan, it starts with a code. That's exactly where it starts, and that's where we have to meet developers. And if we're going to truly solve this privacy problem and really implement sort of the privacy by design ethos in a meaningful way.
Thanks, Steve, for your feedback. And just sort of building onto you, like applications or products are super complex today. Earlier, they were like single applications, probably 10, 20 applications. Now we have distributed architecture, multiple microservices, each changing every day. So it's become super complex. It becomes super distributed. But the reality is, if you move to this application data map approach, you get some advantages right off the bat. So the first one, as we were talking about, you speak the same language as developers. They know which repository they've been working on day in and day out. So if you ask them about, hey, this payment service, what's this about, they will know. So you speak the same language, you get complete coverage because you have the true inventory from source code tools like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. This where code is maintained. And finally, you can align with software sprints, because as code changes happen in a repository, you can make sure you're doing PIA, right? And this is, so far, there's nothing related to Privado. This all you can do without even involving us. You can go back today and say, we will start doing PIAs or maintaining our ROPA reports on a repository level, and it will start to work much, much better. However, it's still not a silver bullet. Essentially, when you start to do it, you will get some advantages, but there'll be two key problems which will still exist: automation and scale. Because you will still do the repository level mapping or application level mapping on a manual basis, it will still take a lot of time. Adoption will still be a challenge, and you will still yearn for automation and scale, and that's where Privado comes in. So yeah, and of course, there's still the human judgment, right? You're still asking someone what's happening in their repository. You want the truth from the code, and that's where sort of Privado will come into the picture. So Privado is a developer-friendly privacy platform. We start from the code. We essentially will run a scan on your entire source code, catalog all the applications, build all the data flows, everything less than 30 minutes. The way we work is, our first step is to connect with source code tools like GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab. And again, these are places where your developers are maintaining the code. So this is literally the source of truth, the ultimate truth, where decisions of data collection, sharing programmatically is made. They run through our code scan, and we build this automatic and dynamic data map. Automatic because you don't have to lift a finger and you get your data map, and dynamic because as the code changes, the data map changes automatically. You don't have to do anything. And the basic component is the same. You have your data elements, you have your third parties, you have your databases, APIs, data flows, the complete picture, everything done automatically. And then the final advantage is, if you look at coming back to the same story, right? If you look at the foundation, which we discussed multiple times, is the data map. If it's complete, accurate, and dynamic, everything above works out. When you're making representation, you have assurance there, right? So you can confidently go out and say, this is our privacy policy, and this is coming from the code. And tomorrow, if the code goes outside the boundary of this privacy policy, we will either update the policy or stop the change. Similarly, you have an inventory for your ops purposes, privacy ops purposes, which is accurate. You know the ad SDKs, you know all the databases and third parties where data is going. So you have an inventory on which you can act on, and you can implement privacy control using policies and apply data minimization purpose limitations. So truly, if you have the data map problem synced with the code, everything else will work out for you. And then we do have some examples. Feel free to go to our website. We have a case study full presented on one of our customers where we delivered this data map in less than 30 minutes, ran assessments which were much more developer friendly, and got the responses much, much faster as well. And so, yeah, if you have any questions on this, happy to answer towards the end of the webinar as well. And that brings us to the exciting piece, the demo of the Privado platform. Perfect. Awesome. Steve, can you see the screen? Can you see the Privado dashboard? You can.
Yeah.
Awesome. Perfect. So let me quickly do a check of the time. So we have some time. So that's interesting. Cool. So this is how the Privado dashboard looks. So what I've done is I have connected some applications or code repositories and essentially ran a scan on them. And what I'm going to show you is what all Privado is finding. And by the way, all of this is automatic. So far, we have not sent any assessment. We have done 0 interviews. Everything is come automatically. So let's start to dig deep into what all Privado finds. So as you can see, there are 3 things. We have this 6 repositories with personal data, 20 data elements, and 7 third party. We're going to go and look at it one by one. But before we go there, let's start to look at the base of our discovery, which is a code repository. As you can see, this is a list of your repositories, each marked with a risk. So imagine if this is your company, it will have a list of all these repositories marked with risk, their data elements, their third parties, if they have any privacy issues, if they're storing data or not. And then once you want to look at it, let's say one of your repository and see what's really happening inside, you just go in and it draws the data map for you. So to begin with, it gives you the insight that here this Privado accounts API is processing 8 data elements and has 5 inventory attached to it. And once you want to dig deep and see what's that all about, you just go to the data elements tab, and this gives you the list automatically. So, and we provide you both options in which you can look at from a tabular view or a list view. But if you focus on the first part, this is the data element, which is building the initial data element inventory, which is what's the data element, which category, what's the sensitivity, is it sensitive under GDPR, CPRA, things like those. And then your data flows. You have your phone number flowing to SendGrid, Slack, is being stored somewhere, is being leaked somewhere, and is being collected as well. So the advantage of Privado is you get all of this information right within the first 2 minutes. You don't need to ask anyone anything. All the information comes from scans, come from the code. And when you want to see this flow diagram, you can simply click and say, I want to see what's happening with email address, and we will build a data flow diagram for you. So what you see on the screen is, again, as I was saying, is coming from the code, and you can see email address is being shared to Slack, SendGrid, and Slack.com, so 3 places, is being stored to some, is being read and write from some databases, is being leaked to logs, and this is something which Steve will tell you from a security perspective is a CWE vulnerability which needs fixing, and then it's being collected. So there are 2 API endpoints from where your email address is coming inside this application. So the advantage is you get these data flow diagrams automatically. For privacy and security teams, you get this visibility. When developers want to look at it and validate it, they get the code. So they can see why Privado is saying, this email address is going to Slack. But when you are investigating, you can see these data flow diagrams and then take a screenshot, share internally, start those conversations. And not only can you do it on a data element level and pick anything and then try to see these data flow diagrams, you can also do that on a level of a third party. So let's say the SendGrid is something which is of interest to the company and you want to see what's, why do we have SendGrid? What are data elements is SendGrid processing? You just click there and you have your reverse data flows. So, in SendGrid, there is email address, phone number, last name, account password, first name, date of birth going. And then you might be wondering why date of birth is going to SendGrid, and that does not follow data minimization principle, because all you need to do is send a like SMS or email from SendGrid. So probably email is fine, first name is fine, last name is fine, phone number is fine for SMS, and password might be token, but this date of birth definitely can be minimized. You can remove it, and you can take this minimization decision just by looking at this flow diagram. And you can take a screenshot, export it, have the discussions internally. So this is how the core product works, wherein we come in, run a scan, build these data flow diagrams, automatically build these inventories, and then you can take a step back and see all the information across all repositories, right? The interesting piece is not only does it build it on a per application basis, but sometimes you want to know on a global basis. So you want to look at your company and say, I want to know a list of all my third parties and what's happening with data there. So for example, in this account, the most used third party is Firebase, Google Firebase, and you want to know what's happening there. So just click there and you get a list of all applications where Firebase is integrated. And then you just do a click and you see all the flows. So like in this health app, 12 data elements are being shared with Firebase. In this application called CardPay, you have some other 7 data elements, right? And if you are in California, emails or text messages are now, I think, sensitive personal information in CPRA. or at least that was the conversation. So yeah, you might want to minimize this email or text messages sharing here. So the meta learning here is that you get this visibility both on an application and an organization level. So that's like the first use case right off the bat. You don't need to send any assessments, you get the entire picture automatically. And once you have this, if you want to get more context, you want to run your PIAs or do your GDPR Article 30 report, RUPA report assessment, you can still use Privado. And the way you do that is you go to your repository, click on assessment, and then just assign it to someone in your team, and off you go. It's very similar to the assessment experiences you might have used, but there is a catch even here. The biggest catch is even these assessments that you're sending for either PIAs or RUPA report are developer friendly. Each of the question here, the description to the way the question was asked is aligned to a developer's experience. The hints are very developer friendly. And the best part is, like, when developer clicks and says, okay, why is Privado saying that phone number is being collected in this application? They can just click on review, and then they see the code, right? You click, you see the data, they see the code. And they can just walk through this entire complex flow and say, oh yeah, I have this sign up which has an email attached to it and it's going to this Slack, and that's why Privado picked it up. And they can mark it confirmed, false positive, validated. All of those flows, advanced flows, exist in Privado. But the main advantage that you'll get is, even if you have to do this privacy impact assessment, because of course it's important to do it even from a legal perspective, your developers will still love it because developer friendly, you're showing it to them, not asking them, it's already pre-filled, and you save tons of time. So I think we are at almost at time with that. So I'll just go back to the slide and then move to the next part, which is a quick recap. Awesome. So hoping that everyone got a glimpse of Privado. In case you want to do a one-on-one demo later, feel free to drop a message on our website, and and our team will reach back to you and set up a one-on-one demo as well. But just to recap, and Steve, I'll use your help as well here. Data mapping still a challenge in 2022. Going from business process to application will save you a ton of time. And if you want to really, really automate everything, try Privado. Do you want to add anything else here?
No, I think that sums up everything, really, really well. It's about time that we started, using tools for privacy like we use tools for security. And so, I think that, and like I said, I'm excited that, Privado's here, and look forward to sort of how the Privado and the larger sort of privacy tool landscape evolves over time. So I think this sums it up nicely.
Awesome. Perfect. I think that brings us towards the end of the webinar. And yeah, if there is anything else, feel free to reach out to the team on our website and we'll be happy to answer those questions. Thanks everyone for joining in for the webinar. Thanks, Steve, for being here and sharing your knowledge. It was amazing to talk, amazing audience. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Take care.
Bye, everyone.